Hi, good to see you all. Good evening, everyone. You know that I always start with deadly punctuality because I don't want to waste a minute. But I want to thank you all for being here on a Friday evening. My name is Paola Antonelli, and together with Christina Mouchou, I run the show. Whoa, these lights are brighter than usual, but that's okay, we'll endure them. So it really is lovely to see you here for what is now Salon number 42, which is quite amazing. And I was really surprised to see how much this number evoked. Of course, I'm not American, but I was reminded by Alan McFarlane that this is Jackie Robinson's number. So Jackie Robinson, of course, you know, the first baseball player that broke the color barrier. And there's a Jackie Robinson Day where all the players wear number 42, and otherwise it's been retired. So that's a very important thing to notice. Also, you know, we have my friend Alex Gorling that sent the clip from Carnal Knowledge when Anne Margaret invites Jack Nicholson to move in together, and he's like, oh, it's good, it's good. So there were many different ideas, but maybe one of the most resonating is the fact that in the Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy, the response that the supercomputer Deep Thought gives to the existential questions that we're all thinking of is 42. And nobody knows what the question was. So maybe really that's a good metaphor for what this evening will be. As usual, these salons are not about reaching conclusions, especially to what good is, but they are ways to kind of reset our questions and maybe expand the importance in our mind of these concepts. And definitely good is something that we talk about a lot and we think about a lot these days. So let's start by talking about a good that is good and does good, which is this Minecaphone, which is a landmine detonator. It was designed by Masoud Hassani, who is at this point is not super young anymore. He was young when we acquired this piece in the collection, but he grew up in Afghanistan, in Kasbah. And he grew up with a lot of mines detonating and also a lot of landmines that were actually sowed all over the territory and that were very scary for kids to play around, well, not with, but play around. So when he reached the Academy of Design in Eindhoven for his thesis, he designed this landmine detonator that is wind-powered. It's made of bamboo, so it's very light, but also heavy enough that it actually will detonate the mine and can be pushed onto fields in order to explode the mine. So you can see there is this sense of like goodness, but also it's a good and it's a piece of design. And usually in these salons, I do not talk about design because in my other life, I'm a design curator, but here I'm representing the Department of R&D, which is trying to prove that museums as a whole can be the R&D of society. So I try to shy away from design, from design as much as I can. But here, with this sense of good, I could not but add the word design to it. And indeed, you know, this museum has had this program, Good Design, for several years in the 1940s and 50s. And it was clear that curators were supposed to tell people what's good and what's bad. And good design, in particular, was function combined with good taste. So such a syllogism, such an equation, right? That was from the original exhibition newsreel. So that's what design curators did at that time. They educated the masses, and especially after the GI Bill and all the new booming middle class that was fed by the subsidies that happened after World War II, there was this sense that people needed to be educated in style and good taste. Funny thing is, to this day, when you get to the 5th floor of this building where the Department of Architecture and Design is, there is this little thing, this little tableau that says that good design, number 1, fulfills its function. Number 2, respects its materials. Number 3, is suited to method of production. And number 4, combines these in imaginative expression. This was by Elliot Noyes, who was the curator of design here in the 1940s. And somehow it still lives by the elevator. And we look at it every single day, even though the idea of good design has changed a lot, as has the world and as has culture. But it's interesting to see that these are words to live by still, so almost commandments. And this leads me to really think of the 10 Commandments and of other scriptures, sacred scriptures, that are supposed to tell us what to live by and how to live. This introduces the different nuances of good that happened all in different religions and also in philosophy. So this is an example of moral absolutism, of course. It's the word. God decides. Whichever God you believe in, God decides. But that also leads us to wonder, what if God changes its mind or his mind or their mind? And is that really something that can live in our life every day? So all of these different nuances of good have led to many different branches of ethics. But the branch of ethics that really deals with it is with goodness. It's called value theory, because in the idea of good is implicit also a judgment, a choice, something that we decide. And we'll talk about many different types of good tonight, but one of the most present in our lives right now is consequentialists. You know, the people that think that almost not the end justifies the mean, but that goodness is defined as the right action. What is morally right depends only on consequences, right? Or there are deontologists that think that goodness is defined by our reason to do something, so the intention defines the good. There are many different aspects of good that we will touch upon tonight, and many that we will not have the time to touch on, but I hope that the readings that we sent you that are also suggested by our speakers will help you in thinking about it more. Is there such a thing as universal good? Well, Norman Rockwell tried, right? So Norman Rockwell, at some point in 1961, made this painting called The Golden Rule that is now as a mosaic in the United Nations building. And that stemmed from a research that he did in 1955, which, by the way, is the same year as the exhibition The Family of Man here at MoMA, very interestingly. So he went all over the world to try and find out, comparing religions, to find one golden rule that was shared by all religions. And what he found is that it is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So this kind of equality of treatment and this measure goodness against yourself and you'll know what others really want is what he found. It's almost an abstraction of the way we can live in the world, and it leads Christina and I to think of this Joaquin Torres Garcia composition, universal constructivism, in which the search for pure geometric forms that is then realized in religious symbols is a way to once again look for this idea of universal goodness. So it is a challenge to understand what good is, and it's a challenge to also defend good. And good, of course, has been used in so many instances as a form of imposition and power grabbing, right? So what happens when a group of people decide that their idea of good trumps every other? Ha ha ha. So this is what happened with the Crusades, but even more recently, we've been talking about terrorism when we see something like this, the attack to the Capitol on January 6th of 2021. It's been called internal domestic terrorism. So terrorism is when the the idea of good of a few, or of some, is imposed on others by any means necessary and also with violence. Let's now move to another idea of absolute good or universal good, the Hippocratic Oath, which was crafted in the 5th century before Christ, and that, of course, was considered to be the golden rule for doctors, right? First, do no harm, and then there are many other different specifications, but this idea of doing no harm has existed since then in different forms. Of course, we know very well, and Marsha Childers today will tell us even more, that morals and decision-making in medicine is much more nuanced than this, but still, it's nice to have some reassurances of what good is. And what good is also changes a lot. And this is something that we will talk about with Nila Saldana. What's the role of the arts in this idea of good? You might have heard all of Peter Singer and his idea of effective altruism and the fact that you need to be really data-based almost in your evaluation of good. There was, I remember how struck I was by an op-ed that Peter Singer wrote in the New York Times many years ago, in which he said that it's more valuable to save people in Africa from blindness than to give any money to museums. And very immediately thereafter, there was an interview in the Financial Times with Bill Gates that was saying exactly the same. The moral equivalent is, we're going to take 1% of the people who visit this museum and blind them. He says, are they willing, because it has the new wing, to take that risk? So it's really interesting. Like it went really down. It got like down and dirty in the ring with museums. So it was fascinating because it made me think a lot. Economics is the basis for some of these conversations, but it's data-based economics, quantifiable economics, which make me think very often economics, at least in the past, used to be the antithesis of thinking about good, at least in some kind of instances. But there are more recently some theories that really try to incorporate goodness and doing good in economics. You might have heard about the donut theory of economics by Kate Raworth. The donut of social and planetary boundaries is this beautiful, facetious, but at the same time also serious idea that we can put everything in balance by trying to make sure that society is balanced and there's gender equality, social equity, political voices for everyone, and housing. And at the same time, we also make sure that our footprint and our weight on the environment is in play and is taken care of. So this theory that we can measure moral progress against this, once again, round object, round donut. So all of a sudden, of course, you cannot read really mathematical equations in this, but it's something to aspire to, this idea of balance. Mariana Mazzucato instead talks about the value of everything, and we go back to value theory, the idea that in order to reform capitalism, we need to reinsert in the political equation common good, the good of all. Instead of the good of the shareholders, that's how we should measure the economical success of a country. Is everybody really participating in our progress? And also trying to always operate with a sense of mission and a collaborative way to do economics. So it really is fascinating to see how all of the different disciplines are pervaded by this. A great example of consequentialism, instead, you might have heard lately, is people throwing soup to masterpieces in different museums. Now, Andreas Malm wrote a book, he's an academic, but a few years ago, he wrote a book saying titled How to Blow a Pipeline, because his idea is that in order to achieve the goal of making people aware of the environmental plight and stopping the land grabbing and the conquering and the colonization of parts of the world that have not been colonized yet, it's better to blow a pipeline than to just protest. Now, he also wrote an op-ed in the New York Times defending the people that are throwing, I was about to say the kids just because they're young. They're not kids, they're humans, and they are activists, and they're trying to make it understood that we are in a really dangerous situation by attacking something that is dear to all, which is masterpieces. Of course, most of them make sure that the masterpieces they attack are glazed, so it's more of a performance, but still, it's attention grabbing, and in the mind of consequentialists, therefore, it is really valuable and right. Another aspect of good: who decides what's good? And good for whom? At this point in our history, humans have all the power, and they decide what's good and what's valuable for the whole planet. But there's a lot of discussion about a rebalancing of the more than human and an attempt to really take that into account. It's something that we need to always think about. Good for whom? Not only humans, but also more than human. And last but not least, now that we are in the making of a new category, a new class of decision makers, AIs, is this an opportunity to really reset our moral values so that we can teach AI to actually help us do better, not only do good. As we know very well, we're going in the opposite direction right now. You see here some examples. Second from the right is Timnit Gebru. You might remember she was the one that rang the alarm on racial bias that's being reinforced by the sets that we use to educate AI, and also the work, the algorithms of oppression and race after technology. Of course, AI is an opportunity, and it would be great to see if we'll be able to take it. So tonight, we will discuss our moral failings and our hopeful future with a great group of speakers. Here they are. First will come Miroslav Volf. I'm not going to go into details in the biographies because you have them in your invitations, but Miroslav is a theologian. I'm going to just tell you who they are so you'll hear all these different viewpoints. Then we have Agustin Fuentes, who's a primatologist and biological anthropologist. Third comes Nira Saldana, who leads the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale and is an effective altruist. Then we will have Erica Capel-James, who is a medical and psychiatric anthropologist. And then Marcia Day Childress, who is a professor emerita of medical education. And last but not least, our beloved Annie Leo, who's a research-based artist. There will also be video interventions from Steven Pinker. Are you laughing? Because, yeah, Steven. I mean, I'm always in conversation with him. Once I did a project called Design and Violence that was against his book. That was, you know, the better angels of our nature. So I'm always having these conversations with him. He's like the positive par excellence. And then Michael Rossi, who is a professor of the history of medicine. Mariana Mazzucato, we talked about her already, an economist. And then Timothy Morton, who is an English professor, but more, he's like a public intellectual, especially in the design and architecture world. So we're going to start right now with Steven's video. Play it, maestro, please.
A good person treats the interests of others as comparable to his or her own. That's why so many thinkers and sages have defined morality as impartiality, the golden rule, the categorical imperative, the veil of ignorance, the view from nowhere. It's why we teach children what's wrong by asking them, how would you like it if he did that to you? But impartiality is not enough. As George Bernard Shaw said, do not do unto others as they would do unto you. They may have different tastes. We need to ground good deeds in something we all share, namely flourishing. Life, health, happiness, sustenance, knowledge, experience, friendship, love. To enhance these goods is to perpetuate the very conditions that allowed each of us to come into existence in the first place. Yet none of us is a saint. We evolved with a dark side, capacity for greed, dominance, vengeance, sadism, but we also evolved with faculties that can inhibit them: empathy, self-control, morality, reason. Mortal humans achieve goodness by empowering their better angels.
I would like to call to the podium Professor Miroslav Volf, please.
Good evening. We were told not to say great words of thanks for organizing all of this, because don't, and it's very hard not to do it. Okay, so I think I need a clicker.
That's right.
Okay. Describing a modern predicament, sociologist Hartmut Rosa writes, in a way, we moderns resemble a painter who is forever concerned about improving their tools, the colors and brushes, the air condition and lighting, the canvas and easel, but never really starts to paint. No good painter will act in such self-sabotaging way. No professional will. And yet, when we step out of our work roles, many of us fixated on means to life and often forget to live our life. Life itself turns into mere means to life. Many are reasons why we slave away. Good. it works. Many are reasons why we slave away in the prison house of means. A key one is that we are confused about the most important question of our lives. We are confused about the nature of the good. In our age, the good has been privatized. It is not just in pluralistic societies, there are many divergent visions of the good. The good itself has become a private matter. To figure out what we should do with our life, we deliberate about talents and interests, we consult family and friends, and what is the one piece of advice that we always get? Not do the greatest good for the greatest number, not love God and neighbors. It is pursue your dream, follow your desires. The privatization of the good puts much weight on our desires and dreams. They rule. But our desires and dreams changed because our world is changing, and while pursuing our dreams, we compete with others. To be ready for a new dream and to win the race, we need good tools, the means to achieve our goals. That's why so much of our personal and social libido is tied to the acquisition of economic, reputational, and bodily capital. This is echo of Pierre Bourdieu. Now, means are tricky things. Concentrate on them and they will morph into ends. Consider money. It's worth nothing in itself. Its value is entirely in being the most potent of means. And just for that reason, it is the most important goal for many. As it is with money, so it is often with know-how, with fame, with looks, and so on. Our means are our ends. Now, the strange behavior of Rosa's painter now starts to make sense. Or does it? In the grip of her fixation on the tools of her craft, Rosa's painter looks in the mirror and sees her face. But it looks curiously hamster-like. She looks around, and the flat studio walls have carved in on her. The floor beneath her is unstable, shifting, and she finds herself running to keep the balance. But for all her running, she's going nowhere. Commenting on this phenomenon, Kenneth Galbraith has years ago said, "Among the many models of the good society, no one has urged the hamster wheel." And yet, most of us are in the wheel. Means are important, indispensable. But the search for the right means will land us in that hamster wheel if we don't ask and answer a prior question, which is not about means, but about goals. What dreams are worth dreaming, or what kind of life is worth living? There is no more important search than the quest for the good life, a life that is worthy of our shared humanity. We are spiritually free and unfinished animals. That indeterminacy at the core of our being is part of our beauty. But it comes with a risk. It opens us to the possibility of failing as humans. In the question of the good, at stake is our very humanity. We can fail in trivial ways, but we can also fail in ways that are catastrophic, both for us and those around us. Albert Speer was Hitler's architect. Hitler recruited him before he turned 30 with the promise that he would be able to design buildings like of which had not been seen for 2,000 years. Seeing himself, above all, as an architect, Speer said yes, and participated in some of the most egregious crimes in history. Singular devotion to his career made him an exceptionally good architect, if you are into this type of architecture. I personally am not. Singular devotion to his career made him also an exceptionally bad human being. Even if we succeed as doctors and artists, furniture makers and politicians, we may fail in big or small ways to live to the inherent worthiness of our humanity. The answer to the question of means consists of facts. The answer to the question of goals consists in basic values. It names the good we should pursue. But how do I determine where I should point the arrow of my life's longing? Not by searching in my inner depths. At best, I will find there a dream which may or may not be a dream of a life that is truly good and worth living. Consulting sciences would not help much either. They are fantastically smart and eloquent in describing what is and how the world functions, including our dream-generating psyche. But they have little to say about what kind of life is good and worth living. Together with some colleagues of mine, I teach a course at Yale called Life Worth Living. We have found that a promising way to start the quest for a good life is by engaging in truth-seeking conversations guided by philosophical and religious teachers of wisdom, both ancient and modern. If you are committed to a path already, I invite you to do the same alone, or even better, with friends. If you need help, pick up a book that we happen to have written. It might not be the best, but it's one available right now. It's called Life Worth Living, a guide to what matters most. But above all, let's go to the sages. Not as we would to smorgasbord, to assemble a plate of wisdom nuggets we like, but let's go to them seeking truth about the good. In their company, may each of us find the courage to pick up the brush and paint with our lives something truly good for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for our planet. Thank you.
Thank you. So you just leave it there. No problem. Thank you so much. Now we have the video by Michael Rossi.
Okay, so what have been the most pivotal historical changes to humans' understanding of good? I can't speak to pivotal changes in all humans' understandings of good, but one of the most pivotal changes in our society's understanding of good comes in the form of a scientific revolution. I'm not talking about a revolution in physics or biology or chemistry. I'm talking here about the 20th century discovery that there is no one thing called culture, that every group of humans throughout history has had a sense of proper behavior, of justice, of attachment, of moral rectitude, in other words, of good. And that idea of good can be quite different for different people, but that too is all good. Now, this might seem obvious today, since it's the root of our idea of multiculturalism. But a century ago, it was widely understood that all humans and all human societies could be classified or ranked according to how advanced they were. That is to say, according to how technologically advanced, how artistically advanced, how morally advanced, and so forth. And advanced in this case meant, predictably enough, what scientists and their clients in government and schools and medicine and in museums thought was good. And then along came anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Franz Boas with the realization that good was much more complicated. Suddenly, the world was bigger, it was much more expansive, and much more confusing. And this redefinition of culture opened up science and art and history and literature and music and aesthetics to multiple different and surprising forms of good. And we today have inherited this scientific revolution, this redefinition of culture according to anthropological science. And as we know, it can be difficult, it can be fractious, and it can be disorienting. But in all of its weird, wonderful, kaleidoscopic chaos, it is also, I think, good.
Now I would like to call to the podium Agustin Fuentes.
There. So a few years ago in Finland, a black bear and a wolf found each other. And they spent 4 weeks hunting, sleeping, sitting with one another. They were friends. They formed relations. This was good. We're going to come back to that. But I want to start not just with the bear and the wolf and a multi-species relation is good, but to point out that humans have a history. We have a deep history. The history that I'm talking about is millions of years old. And we know that over the past 6 million years, or even 2 or 3 million years, a number of things, of ancestors, of relatives, of cousins, of things like us have existed. And yet we are today the only ones left. Why? What is it? What's our superpower? Why us? I would like to suggest that 2 to 3 million years ago, we, our ancestors, were 4.5 foot tall, naked, hairless, fangless, clawless, hornless, ape-like creatures running around with some sticks and rocks. How did they make it? They made it because they had one another. They formed incredible relations and commitments, bonds and emotions, loves and hates, complex interactions where relations, emotions, and commitments to one another were at the very core. Whether it was in this incredible technology of making stone tools, of taking rocks and seeing within them. I know most people aren't impressed by like stone tools, but you should be. Nothing else has taken a rock and saw inside that rock is a tool and made it happen. Nothing else on the planet. So whether it was making stone tools or working out how to care for the most needy, long childhooded infant of any species on the planet. We worked together, we related, we developed collaborative, cooperative, and communicative relations that allowed us to move forward, to share food, to understand each other's needs and wants and desires, and to see the world as it is, imagine new possibilities, and then to create them collaboratively, communicatively, cooperatively in the world. That is the superpower that humans have. And together, through these kinds of relations, for better and for worse, we have us today. We have the diversity of cultures, of planets, of contexts, of economies, of wars, of loves, of hates. It is relations and the flourishing of these relations that is the heart of what it means to be human. And I argue this is good because when I say it's at the heart of the human, I do literally mean that. It's in your heart, it's in your brain, it's in your liver, it's in your endocrine and circulatory systems. The last 3 million years have seen the evolution of a particular dynamic in a particular set of species that has created an incredible opportunity for relations. And the flourishing of those relations, we know, when our relationships flourish, our heart health, our overall circulatory health, and our mental health are successful. So we know that there is a good in relations, but it's not just us, in fact, because humans don't live on the planet by themselves. We actually live with many, 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 many other organisms and much of the material world. And it is not just our superpower, right, to flourish together, to change our bodies so that this connection is good. It is our ability to cast that wide to other species. For example, we know for the last 25 to 35,000 years, humans and our canine companions, our dog friends, have been together mutually shaping one another. And I'm going to prove that right now. This is Shelley. The fact that you just laughed is because you feel good for this moment because she's looking at you. You have had a physiological connection, and for those of you who don't know, dogs and humans are the only 2 species that can cause yawn contagion amongst one another because we have co-evolved cognitive complexity because of relations. And dogs also, I think, make the best philosophers. I'll let you read this. I could end here with the dog. But the point is that it is not just dogs, but a wide variety of species pull out relations and enable this cross-species flourishing of relationship, which we are and feel as good. So this is not the only definition of good, but it is one that is absolutely central. The human capacity to be with others, to communicate, to collaborate, to have our bodies and minds and hearts connect with one another is a way in which we are good physiologically and psychologically. And our superpower is the ability to cast that not just to other humans, but to cast that to other species in incredibly powerful ways. So let me come back to some real good. This is a dog and an elephant who found each other, both rescue animals, and who have spent the last 14 years living together in sheer joy of relation. The flourishing of relations is good. It's not the only good, but it is physiologically, psychologically, and evolutionarily what we are capable of. Thank you.
Thank you, Agustin. Thank you. And now, Neela, Professor Neela Saldana, please. Yeah, professor. Everybody's professor here. No, except for Annie and myself.
So hello, everyone. I don't know if you've guessed from my sari, but I was born and I grew up in India, in the city of Bombay. It's now called Mumbai. It's a city of 22 million people. So that's, I think, more than double the population of New York City. And by any estimates, about 40 to 55% of people live in slums in Mumbai. I was one of the fortunate 50% who did not live in a slum. In fact, I grew up in a very upper middle class family in India, which meant that, I had some exposure to American culture, however skewed. Archie comics, you know, the thing that we salivated about were Twinkies, Hostess cupcakes for many, many years growing up in Bandra. So when I came to, all this to say, when I came to America as a graduate student in my 30s, there was really no great culture shock, no fresh off the boat kind of view of coming from India to America, except for one thing. Well, two things, actually. The first thing was Hostess Twinkies were not as good as I thought they would be. That was really disappointing. But the second one was that I could drink clean water out of a tap. And here's the thing, and I know that's not true tragically in all parts of the US, I never imagined growing up in that upper middle class family in India with all of the things. We had a house, we had a car, we had vacations, that you could actually drink clean water out of the tap. The government's responsibility was to give you water. It was then your responsibility to boil the water and to filter the water. And if you couldn't afford it, well, you know, you got diarrhea or whatever, but it wasn't the government's responsibility. And so I think to be an immigrant is to endure permanent whiplash. It is to have a visceral reminder every time you head back to your birth country of how the other half lives, that the air pollution that we saw on the left-hand side in New York City for the last 2 days, which is so dangerous, is the whole winter in Delhi, and it's twice as bad. The air filters don't even record it because it's so bad. And for a long time, I knew this. I'm enduring this whiplash every year when I go back, but I didn't really do anything about it. And a big part of that is extreme absolute poverty, like you see in India and many parts of the world, where people survive on less than the equivalent of $1.90 a day. It's so huge a problem that I thought I couldn't possibly do anything. And so I thought to myself, what a good person is a person who pays their taxes, returns the library books on time, you know, votes for good people, volunteers in my community. I'm in the United States of America, India's there, there's not much I can do. Let's just leave it at that. And then a few years later, I read this article, and what was really, what really struck me was not the first part of that, what should a billionaire give? This had just come out when Bill Gates had decided to pledge the bulk of his fortune to charity, but it was the second half of that headline, and what should you? And in that article, I was really introduced to this concept of the drowning child. And it's a very simple thought experiment. You're walking by work, you're in your work clothes and your shoes, and you are walking by a shallow pond. And you see a toddler in the pond, and the toddler's flailing, and the toddler's going to drown. And you could easily wade in, the water's knee deep, and you could save the child at no danger to yourself. you may ruin your shoes or your work clothes. Would you do it? And if you're like me, you say, of course. I mean, I would be a monster, right? To like not wade into that pond and save the child. Well, it turns out that every day in the world, there's not one but thousands of those drowning children. They're dying of preventable diseases, 14,000 children a day. And those diseases, pneumonia, malaria, diarrhea, have solutions, easily preventable solutions. The fact that they're almost eradicated in the United States tells us that these are solutions. And one way is, but those solutions require resources, they require money. And one way is those of us who are fortunate enough to have that excess income could donate it, we would save the lives of many children. And even as a grad student, I knew I had this excess income. I did the calculations. But instead of thinking about others who might need that money, I was kind of going past the shallow pond and saying, let me go and buy another pair of shoes. And so, one of the main reasons I wasn't acting, even though I knew this, is because the issue with many nonprofits and organizations that work is not fraud. You see some bad players, but the real issue is that many charities are simply ineffective. They say they're going to do something, and either for reasons beyond their control or because they haven't thought through it or something happens, they just don't achieve what they set out to do. They don't solve the problem. And then I came across the story of two young hedge funders. They thought the way we rate these charities is outdated. Charities are typically rated on how low the overheads are. Now think about that. That's like buying an iPhone versus a Google phone because you think the CEO of Apple is paid less than the CEO of Google, right? And we don't do that with purchases. We buy what's best for us. Why would we do that when we are trying to do good in the world? And so they set up this idea that we should look at charities, have a way to measure their impact. They set out to find these charities. That's what GiveWell is. They have a list of these organizations that have proven results. I just want to leave you with the thought that they've estimated it costs about $3,500 to $4,000 to save a life. That's what Apple's Vision Pro actually costs. So that's just a thought there. So it turned out by thinking about these two questions, what is my responsibility to the child in the pond, wherever that child might be in the world, our shared humanity, and two, how can I ensure that I'm actually saving the child in the pond and not just, giving my money to someone who told me they'll save the child but can't really swim? I'd stumbled into this notion of effective altruism, which simply put is a movement around thinking about how to do the most good. And it means thinking about, what constitutes the most good and for who? Is it just about fellow human beings suffering from extreme poverty? Is it about all sentient beings, animals, and preventing animal suffering for our own pleasure? Is it about future generations of human beings whose lives are under threat because of climate change, pandemics, artificial general intelligence? So it really means thinking about this and that expanding moral circle. And the trouble with this is that it never stops. It's very inconvenient. The problem with starting to think deeply about how to do the most good, you could think like Zell Kravinsky or Dylan Matthews, you don't need your second kidney, and you could donate your kidney to someone. Or you could think, well, I'm far above the median, and I should probably, give away all my money till I reach the median income of somebody living in India. So I'm not there yet. I just want to end with saying I probably never will be there yet. I have no thoughts of donating my kidney just yet. So should I give up? And I really think that the thing that motivates me is this idea of a personal best. We don't run because, we don't give up running because we're not going to win the New York Marathon. And I think about Martinus Evans, who's a 300-pound runner who has a run club called Slow AF Run Club. And his whole point is he says, I want everyone to know they can run in the body they have right now. I think it's something similar. I want everyone to know we can do good in the body and with the resources we have right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Neela. That was beautiful. Now we have a video by Mariana Mazzucato.
Hello, my name is Mariana Mazzucato. I'm a professor at University College London, where I direct the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And that word, public purpose, is a heavy word. It's a beautiful word, but only if we have a framing for it. We often hear people talk about the common good. For example, we have 17 sustainable development goals, which every country from the United States to Brazil to Italy to Congo have signed up to. Now, what does it mean to sign up to some common goals? my view as an economist is it means much more than just talking about those goals. It means actually having a frame for how to talk about the collective value creation that's required to get there. How do we share the knowledge? How do we share the risks? How do we share the rewards? But also who decides how those goals are interpreted at the local level? These questions are about co-creation of the objective. They're about co-creation of the investment trajectory, and co-creation also of how to share the knowledge, share the risks, share the rewards along the way. And for this, I've been thinking a lot about the need to really revive the notion of the common good. Why is that? Because in economics, and again, I'm speaking here as an economist, forgive me, in economics, we talk a lot about things like the public good, which sounds good because there's two words and one is good. But if it's only framed as the ability, for example, of the public sector to fix what we call market failures, then we have a problem because it becomes a correction. It's no longer an objective, whereas the common good surely is a very ambitious objective of what we're trying to do, and a lot of attention on the how. So of course, we need to take care of things like intellectual property rights, that they're not too extractive, the design of a public-private partnership, the design of financial institutions that are actually fostering something that's good for society, not just handing out money here and there. So really what I've been trying to do for the last years is to kind of revive that notion of the common good away from just being a correction towards being an objective, and really thinking through what it means not to level the playing field, but to tilt the playing field in that direction. And I'll just stop there because my time is up, but I do think that for the cultural sector, for the arts, this is huge. It means who decides what value is? How do we co-create that value? How do we measure it in a dynamic way and not a static way? And especially, what does it mean to bring as many different voices to the table so that we can truly be thinking about that directional shift we need in the economy in a way that is as inclusive as the process itself to get there? Thank you very much.
Okay, and now I would like to call to the podium Professor Erica Capel-James, please.
Thank you, Paula and Christina. How do we advance?
Oh, with the green arrow.
Okay. All right. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm also going to give you all permission, if you're sitting, to stretch if you need to, stand up, take good care of your bodies as we're proceeding. International humanitarian and development interventions in Haiti and domestic charity among diaspora Haitians in the United States reveal facets of good as a verb, adjective, and noun. Two cases demonstrate the challenges of doing and being good from the mid-1990s to early 2000s. The first involves international efforts to reconstruct post-conflict Haiti. The second shows how Catholic charity offered to Haitian refugees enabled American Samaritans to define, do, and be good, while the clergy sex abuse scandal unfolded. I argue here that efforts to define, do, and be good, and to care, produce, and consume well are fraught with double binds and paradoxes regarding how best to aid others. The September 30, 1991 coup d'etat in Haiti against democratically elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide inaugurated a 3-year period of unlawful rule by the coup apparatus, composed initially of the Haitian military and civilian paramilitary attachés, and later adding the repressive FRAP organization. This apparatus targeted pro-democracy activists and their families with terror, using torture, systematic rape, disappearances, and murder, particularly in poor, high-density, pro-Aristide neighborhoods. In October 1994, the US and UN multinational force intervened to restore democracy and order, as well as to reintegrate former combatants, but without fully disarming them. The aid assemblage did not substantially address the needs of Haiti's human rights abuse survivors until the USAID-funded Human Rights Fund Victim Assistance and Rehabilitation Program launched in 1997. In addition to aiding the Haitian Department of Justice and Haitian clinicians, The program helped over 1,000 direct victims of organized violence and their extended families. Until its closure in spring 2000, beneficiaries were provided 1 year of legal aid, medical and psychological care, and limited economic support. I also have a little bit of product placement. The rehab program's obligation to meet donor objectives in a limited time frame conflicted with Haitian beneficiaries' need for longer-term assistance. Staff transformed clients' medical receipts, witness testimonies, injury photos, and expert affidavits into dossiers, enabling legitimate victims access to social services and potential justice and reparations. These trauma portfolios also provided evidence of competent clinical goods and services, and ultimately circulated as commodities in a humanitarian market. Aggregated trauma dossiers generated currency, not only for the victim, but also for the intervening institution. So what I documented in some ways was the way that trauma became a commodity in and of itself. However, as I observed during my research, when international aid waned and the Haitian state lacked the ability to provide sustained care for its citizens, some of Haiti's human rights victims crafted, performed, and distributed false stories of new abuses to revive international interest in their plight. They recognized how trauma had been commoditized as a good. Other Haitians fled their homeland to seek asylum and salvation abroad. New case, different time period, but resonant issues. In the late 19th to early 20th centuries, U.S. Catholic Samaritans offered charity as a means to distribute material and spiritual capital throughout a community and to assess collective works of mercy in an economy of merits and satisfactions, or merits and faults. As immigrants and as stigmatized religious minorities, the large influx of poor and ill European Catholics posed threats to the Protestant majority, particularly in New England. By attending to immigrant bodily illness, Catholics promoted public health and welfare. Charity enabled Samaritans to demonstrate their civic responsibility to the secular state and to accumulate both social, material, and spiritual capital. By 1980, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops was awarded the largest subcontracts from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. Haitians epitomized the suffering strangers whom Good Samaritans must befriend, feed, clothe, save, and incorporate into full life in the church. Aiding individuals stigmatized erroneously as vectors of HIV/AIDS and depicted as practicing the maligned Vodou religion engendered both merit and justice for the interveners. During the 1991 and 1994 coup years in Haiti, the Bush administration interdicted thousands of Haitians at sea as a so-called humanitarian measure and detained them in Guantanamo prior to repatriation to Haiti. Few were given asylum, but Boston's Cardinal Bernard Francis Law intervened. This intervention occurred, however, alongside the emergence of the clergy sex abuse crisis in the United States. Catholic charity extended to Haitians may have offered a means to counterbalance the negative impact of Catholic corporate ethics scandals. On February 24, 1992, while the plight of Haitian detainees in Guantanamo was becoming prominent in the media, the New York Times announced the formation of a church commission to examine decades of accusations of sexual abuse of minors by priests in the Archdiocese of Chicago. On May 8, 1992, in the Boston Globe, 9 men and women in southeastern Massachusetts alleged Reverend James R. Porter had sexually molested them as children in the 1960s, and they intended to sue the church. On May 22nd, 1992, so just a couple weeks later, in his appeal to President Bush for clemency for imprisoned Haitians, Cardinal Law from Boston evoked the collective moral failure permitting the Holocaust, then redefined the good. In the name of all that is decent, we cannot turn our backs on poor Haitians willing to take heroic measures in order to escape a hopeless situation, which is made worse by a failure of resolve on the part of the international community. Excuse me. The next day, a reporter questioned Law about the abuse charges made against Reverend Porter. Law publicly called down God's power against the media, particularly the Globe, for their lack of coverage of the church's benevolent work and disproportionate coverage of the emerging clergy pedophilia scandal. In July 1992, with President Bush's direct agreement and support from the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and Greater Boston Catholic Charities, Cardinal Law resettled 111 Haitian unaccompanied minors from the detention camps in Guantanamo Bay to a Boston monastery and then an archdiocesan convent. This initiative was called Projet La Vie, Project Life. The goal of Projet La Vie was to help the Haitian minors to acculturate and to resettle in the United States, either with members of their own extended families or foster families. I'm left asking, did such good work help Greater Boston Catholics to atone for failures to protect other minors at other periods? So in conclusion, charity appears inextricably linked to security and salvation, however you define it, at individual, collective, and institutional or corporate levels. By accepting government funding and oversight, alongside the private gifts or philanthropy that individuals, foundations, and corporations continue to offer, mission-driven organizations gain greater fiscal security. They also risk compromising their independence and mission. Hybrid public, private, and secular sacred partnerships may humanize otherwise indifferent social policies. But in turn, these hybrid partnerships may limit the risks that vulnerable persons entrusted to the care of private humanitarians will be subjected to exploitation or abuse. If such partnerships fail to provide the good, Haiti's continued turmoil sadly represents a nearly inexhaustible supply of opportunities to accumulate capital, whether in the economy of merits and faults or in humanitarian markets. As anthropologist Mary Douglas once said, though we laud charity as a Christian virtue, we know that it wounds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Professor Marsha Day Childress, please. Maestro upstairs.
Whoops, how do I go back? Oh, no, we're good, we're good. So I've been asked to speak to whether art can help us better approach moral dilemmas in healthcare. In a word, yes. I'll elaborate how guided visual art observation in a museum can contribute to the clinical expertise of apprentice doctors and nurses. I'll suggest how art can help clinicians at all levels approach moral dilemmas both in and for medicine. And I'll ask whether art and museums might do more to help medicine meet its own moral challenges. The good care of all of us now and in future may be at stake. For 11 years, our medical school's Center for Health, Humanities, and Ethics has partnered with the University of Virginia's Fralin Museum of Art and academic curator Jordan Love, who created the visual art exercises I'll describe. Our partnership links the museum with the medical school. Right on grounds, the museum is a convenient lab where students can team up and learn through and with art. Why leave the lecture hall and hospital for the museum? 3 reasons. First, going to the museum shifts both place and pace of learning. Physically apart from medicine's and nursing's territorial cultures and hierarchies of identity, authority, and work, the museum as neutral space evens things out. Away from relentless hospital routines, learners can slow down, sharpen their looking and listening, separate description from interpretation and judgment, retreat from algorithmic decision-making, tangle with ambiguity and uncertainty, wonder. Second, deployed in the museum, arts, methods, materials, and learning modes inquire with remarkable cognitive and emotional efficacy into the human experiences of illness. And guided learning in the gallery enables trainees to practice skills that aren't taught well through medical didactics and clinical modeling. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Third, space designed, museums are spaces designed for contemplation and creative engagement. So the museum is a sanctuary. Stressed clinicians can breathe, feel, laugh, behold, and reflect on things whole and beautiful. Those who are welcomed into the museum for guided learning often return on their own later for refuge, renewal, recharging. We've created 2 museum workshops using art. One enables apprentice clinicians to practice clinical skills. The other exercises these skills relative to care at the end of life. Clinician's eye is grounded in visual art observation using visual thinking strategies. Led by museum educators and docents with healthcare and health humanities expertise, the 2-hour workshop is part of our required Foundations of Clinical Medicine course. 3 modules, visual inventory, team drawing, and word association, exercise an array of ethically significant clinical skills. In each activity, art is site and occasion for intensive group work. Clinician's eye exercises these skills: attention and observation, communication, teamwork, moral and ethical presence, cultural humility, problem solving, empathy, tolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty, reflection and self-awareness, emotional engagement, and resilience. Our other workshop, Heart of Medicine, began when medical and nursing students seeking to understand end-of-life matters that affect patients, families, and themselves asked the museum to create an art-based learning experience. Every autumn, Heart of Medicine convenes in the museum for an evening organized around images of death and dying, loss and grief. Museum educators and docent volunteers versed in VTS and end-of-life care guide the students' explorations, starting with and then springing off of artwork, ruminating on what is a good death, referencing their own losses and grief. Clinician's eye and Heart of Medicine strategically use art to attend to what are at heart moral dilemmas in medicine. With eyes on art, learners say what they see and hear what each other see and say. Approaching art together from diverse perspectives, they probe what it means to be human and mortal, feel empathy and exercise compassion, how moral perception and emotional intelligence figure in patient care, how uncertainty permeates all their work, can muddle decision-making and cause moral distress. Given current concerns about social violence and clinician burnout, we've incorporated into some workshops explicit images of persons in distress. Responding to these in safe space, learners can recognize suffering, including their own. Bias, blame, and violence against racial and ethnic groups can complicate moral dilemmas in healthcare. Examining images of grievous harm and its aftermath, challenging as this is, enables learners to speak and listen to each other about deeply disturbing, even personally hurtful experiences that may otherwise be unspeakable. Clinician burnout is a moral dilemma for medicine. Corporate healthcare's conflicting and compounding imperatives of productivity and cost cutting put clinicians' inner lives at risk. Many can no longer work without risking moral injury, betraying their oaths to tend the sick, losing their own souls. COVID laid bare how ill-equipped, materially and emotionally, our healthcare workforce is to endure dire working conditions and be compassionately present. The U.S. Surgeon General has pointed up this crisis. The toll on health workers is alarming. More than half report symptoms of burnout. American healthcare needs changing, and most fixes aren't in the art's bailiwick. But art can be more than hospital decor. Art does serious work and could do heavier lifting for healthcare. If clinicians' eye, heart of medicine, and our students signal the good that art can contribute to clinical skills mastery and the parsing of medicine's moral problems, perhaps health professionals, schools, and health systems should invest in museum partnerships. Educators from both domains could co-create art-mediated learning to better equip clinicians for ethical practice, reduce threats to patient safety and quality of care, make workplaces more humane and healthier for everyone. In this, we have allies. The Association of American Medical Colleges is encouraging medical schools to integrate arts and humanities into their required curricula to prepare the most capable, compassionate, resilient physicians. Calling on healthcare systems to confront the crisis in worker burnout, the National Academy of Medicine identified 6 essential elements for worker well-being. Unfortunately, they didn't include the arts. They overlooked a resource rich and ready. Robust new work in the neuroscience of arts benefits could come into play. Museum-based learning at more than 100 U.S. medical schools could be deployed at scale, even on a trial basis, and studied. We sometimes prescribe art for patients. Why not for health systems? Clinicians in the Art Museum, by all means. Museum medicine partnerships offer promise at this critical time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have a video by Timothy Morton.
The fact that you're a sexually reproducing life form means that you have sexual display. This is a thing that goes at least all the way down to beetles. Just think about the fact that they have iridescent wing cases, which means that art goes all the way down at least to the level of beetles. And as far as I'm concerned, whatever art is really just the sentience of sentience. And since we know that plants have sentience, and indeed there are things called flowers which are also sexually reproducing, we can assume that just to be a life form at all, unless you're one of those boring cloning ones, is all about art. Whether that has anything to do with goodness, I don't know, but it's saying something true about life, which is saying something true about the universe, which is that the universe is capable of producing beautiful accidents. Beauty and art are a beautiful accident, sex is a beautiful accident, life is a beautiful accident. And why? Because we live in a quantum universe in which a genuine future is possible. In other words, the future can be different from the past, which is something that everyone needs to know deep down right now to be extremely true. And I don't know if it's any good. You know, mercy isn't necessarily any good. Revenge is efficient. But mercy is malfunctioning revenge, and if anything, life is the universe having mercy on itself And the 0 degree of mercy is just hesitating to take that kind of mechanical revenge, because luckily we do not live in a universe that's fundamentally based on revenge. We live in a universe that's fundamentally based on mercy.
Thank you. Thank you, Timothy. And now I'd like to call to the podium Annie Liu.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited to be in this conversation. I'm not a philosopher or an ethicist or an anthropologist, and I have to say I have not really thought about good before being invited to this panel. So after struggling with this prompt for a few days, I decided that the only way to consider this topic is through my own life. And in my life right now, aside from being an artist and a professor, my main job is being a mother. So controversially, I decided I'm going to contemplate what it means to be a good mother. And I know probably warning emojis are firing all over your brain right now because there's no right you can do as a mom, I feel like. Are you a working mom? How dare you abandon your kids? Are you a stay-at-home mom? That's so unfeminist. Me on the stage right now, who's watching your kids? In fact, there's 200 million more Google search results for the term bad mother than there are for good mother. We love the idea of a bad mom so much, we make movies about it. And these movies are so popular, they have sequels. And all joking aside, I think I take my aspiration of being a good mother really seriously because to me, there's a lot at stake. So how to approach the concept of good motherhood? Well, there are no lack of guides out there, and there have been guides like this throughout history proffering such sage advice ranging from bathe your kids in lard to kissing and holding your babies will spoil them, so just don't do it. Media and big companies also chime in on how to be a good mother. This one says, smoking causes low birth weight, and that's a good thing. And easy labor, a slim baby. Smoke cigarettes that doctor spoke. The advice on how to be a good parent changes over time. So how do I stay objective? How do I find what's truly good through all this noise? So I thought I could ask science. What does research say on the topic? And as much as I love evidence-based truths, this approach can be tricky. For one, research around women's reproductive bodies is steeped in histories of sexism and racism, resulting in biased and incomplete knowledge. I love science, I really do, but humans who can be sexist and racist also make science. And while I deeply believe in the scientific method, there are still shadows from our history in everything from the process, the language, the naming of the reproductive system that can be problematically filtered through a male gaze. And this filters down to parenting advice, and it can result in the infantilizing of mothers and making women just not trust themselves. As you can see in these demeaning ads, well, what do you know about babies? And when your baby cries, is it your fault or his? And this is not to say that I don't love data and science and knowledge. I think we actually need more research in this domain. For instance, in PubMed, there are twice as many papers about erectile dysfunction than there are about breast milk. So how does this all trickle down into my attempts to be a good mother? Take something as simple and complicated as feeding a baby, for example. Just one tiny aspect of parenting, but so controversial, so much judgment. I thought to myself, surely with enough data, I could find the key to how to be a good mother. And when my daughter was first born, she had a really low birth weight. She lost a lot of weight after she was born, which I learned later was normal. But as a first-time mom, I totally freaked out. And I constantly had to explain to the pediatrician why she was losing weight. So I kept this meticulous chart of every time she was fed and changed. So from left to right, the first 30 days of her life, from top to bottom, the 24 hours of the day. Pink bars are when she was fed, and blue bars are when she was changed. Not a lot of sleeping. In those early days, I learned as much as I could about breastfeeding and formula feeding. I talked to mothers and lactation consultants. I read papers. I even collected little samples of my breast milk every day and just stared at it under a microscope. Just, please, someone help me. Breastfeeding, of course, is ancient. We are considered mammals. One of the characteristics, which is to have mammary glands to produce milk, as I tearfully lamented to my partner in those early days when I wasn't lactating. Lucky for me, we have been inventive and resourceful at feeding our kids. Unlucky for me, we've also developed interesting superstitions, such as this one: don't poison your kid with angry breast milk. Society tells us conflicting notions of what is the best food or even just what is a good food for a baby. After infant formula was commercialized, marketing companies spent a lot of effort to convince mothers that formula was superior to human breast milk. And by 1970, breastfeeding in the US fell to an all-time low of 25%. And a major factor in this was that formula companies would just give tons of free samples to hospitals, which would then give it to babies as soon as they were born, which can impact your supply. The CDC now says that breastfeeding is the best food for babies, and the World Health Organization recommends that we should do it for 2 whole years. However, not all research paints such a rosy picture of breast milk. Breast milk, just like other parts of our bodies, now contain microplastics, pesticides, heavy metals, possibly air pollution. There are a whole host of reasons why some mothers choose to breastfeed, to formula feed, to hybrid feed, from mastectomies to being adoptive or same-sex parents. This formula ad points out that nearly 75% of US parents will turn to formula within the first 6 months, so why are we so ashamed to talk about it? Whether or not a person decides to breastfeed is a personal choice that I think we should support. As an artist, I'm interested in the social attitudes to and the legal status of breastfeeding in public that ladders up to bigger political and economic factors. As I started to feed my kids, I was blown away by how much work it was. Care work is a form of invisible labor, like hidden infrastructure that makes the world run. And I learned that breastfeeding is made to be invisible labor. It wasn't until 2018 that all 50 states in the US made breastfeeding legal in public, like 2018, that was like yesterday. And in parallel, it's censored in some digital spaces as well. So can design shape how we feed our babies? And by extension, how we mother? Can design help me be a good mother? The problem of breastfeeding became tricky for me because when I gave birth to my second child, I got a new job and I didn't get paid maternity leave. So as a result, I was working 5 days postpartum and I spent a lot of time with my pump. In this sculpture, I show the amount of milk that I pumped in a week, approximately 1.5 gallons. The milk in the sculpture runs on a rhythm, the rhythm of my breast pump. So consider the breast pump. Does it empower me to feed my baby and return to work? Or does its existence of such a technology obligate my postpartum body back into the labor force before I'm ready, regardless of my socioeconomic availability? Employers are now mandated to give workers a space for lactation, but often is nothing more than a broom closet with a taped-on sign that says pumping room. This is a photo series by artist Corinne Botts, who's been photographing the real spaces where working women pump. How does public infrastructure and systemic support impact my ability to be a good mother? Or maybe even better, how to support parents feeding their infants? How about paid parental leave? So to wrap things up, in a sea of shifting cultural values and ever-changing science, how do you become a good parent? The idea of motherhood, fatherhood, parenthood, just like the idea of good, is a social construct, and as such will always be subject to changing with shifting tides. So in your mind's eye, what does a good mother look like? Is this a good mother? Are these good mothers? Can you believe these ads are designed for Mother's Day? Is this a good mother? What about this one? So like anyone today, I asked AI what a good mother looks like. And these are the images of a good mother generated by AI. These are the first 28 images that it created based on this prompt. And as you can see, it's not very diverse. And we know, of course, that AI-generated images reflect our current data sets for a particular term. So it's not random that good mother returns these images of happy, light-skinned women holding babies in bright, sunny backgrounds. We clearly need to diversify our data set to challenge these notions of what a good mother looks like. We need more stories on what motherhood is from diverse communities. In my own reproductive journey, I learned there's no one way to mother. We're diverse, with diverse bodies, personal histories, cultural backgrounds. There are limits to the data we currently have, and science is situated, also always partial, dynamic, shifting. And so I find this to be the perfect space for art. Notions of good, notions of equality are socially constructed. Artists telling their truths about motherhood can impact cultural perceptions and hopefully systemic change. And I just wanted to end with a quote I found on our reading list. It says, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better." And I think this is a good summary of my own approach to good parenting. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. You can stay. Thank you. I'm gonna call you all to sit. Wonderful presentations, all of you. Thank you very much. Please sit however you feel like it. Marsha, you're left. Come with me. So it was really an amazing, amazing set of presentation that left me thinking. And I'm going to start with the person that spoke first, which is Miroslav. So Miroslav, so we exist in a pluralistic society. So, which means that we each have our own private conception and definition of the word good. How do the different ideas of good relate to each other? And how can there be a discussion or a negotiation of the discrepancies?
It's really interesting. I mean, you invite me to talk to you about the course that we teach at Yale, which is where we present maybe 7 accounts of the life that is worth living in various traditions. They may be religious, they may be secular, contemporary philosopher, ancient philosophers, whatever that might be. And the interesting thing is that even if you ask the question, each of these traditions makes a truth claim. Now we want to take the truth claim seriously, and then you open up the discussion. You think you would have a kind of brawl in the class, but you don't. You have a civilized discussion about things that are so fundamental to us. And at the same time, it's possible to have this conversation that teases out and that contrasts and that kind of ask also of existential impact of those traditions. So I don't think our difficulty is really discussing some of this. Oh, thank you. This can be on the ground. Wisdom is gone from there. It's right. Yeah.
So it's what you were saying. So instead of means, it's facts. Because I was thinking then it's the proof in the pudding. It's to put people in front of the kid drowning in the pond that really makes our differences come alive. So discussion is always civilized, but then...
Well, it ends up not being civilized when you're outside of the classroom. When the key life interests are at stake. But that's very interesting then, right? Because we can kind of have agreements in principle on various things, or even agreements to kind of disagree, to see that we have overlapping consensus. And yet when it comes to actually living it and implementing it, that's where interests kick in a major way and conflicts arise. And I think we have to have ways in which we can have almost like a meta values that are values of conversation, of engagement mutually, so that the kind of relationship that of which Augustine spoke could be fostered, rather than bringing closer to people creates only more tensions between them. And some of these, I think, where traditions do agree, is a sense of honoring the other person. And I think they can be teased out. Some of them can be pushed, so to speak, in function of conflicts. They have been disregarded, and these various aspects, I think we need to elevate, nurture in our relationships. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Agustin, this idea of respect, which is fundamental. You were talking about an evolution of dynamics, and you first spoke about humans, and then you introduced other species. So why is it so difficult for humans to broaden their conception of good to not only include other species, but the entire planet and its future?
42.
Yeah, 42, thank you.
No, so we actually know the answer. That's why I said 42. We don't know all the questions. So you asked this broad question, but I will push back a little bit and say that actually humans know how to get along. We know. We physiologically, evolutionarily, biologically, and in our everyday lives do this all the time. When people were coming up and walking into the building, they sort of stood in line. They waited for someone else to go through on average. When they were trying to get into the middle seats, people sort of slided to the side and say, excuse me. We actually do know intrinsically and culturally how to get along. However, this idea of relationships also has a really bad outcome, right? Which army wins a battle? The army that is most aggressive and individually violent, or the army that cares the most for each other, that is together and willing to die for their comrades? That one. So these relationships have multiple sides. It's not good or bad, it's how they play out. And I think what we need to do in the current moment, as we just heard, is to think through who's structuring the cultural expectations of relationships, who's telling us what is important and what is not important. How are those ideologies created? Because the relationships are always there, right? We can see them out there. But whether your relationship drives you to try to storm the Capitol or to hold the door open for someone else, those frames, those structures, whether it's love, hate, right, care, violence, all of those are tied into these relational components. And so the
what
ideology.
about other species?
So that comes down to the exact same thing for other species, right? Many humans here, many people here probably have a dog or a cat at home, or have had at one point how many of you have had a dog or a cat in your life, right?
Oh my God,
so you've
I'm
had
so
this
jealous.
incredible multi-mammal, multi-species environment, and we know what
I don't
that
have
love.
it, but I watch Instagram videos of little
Well, that's
animals
right.
all night.
So the care is there. We know that capacity, yet at the same time, and I'm going to say right now, I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian, but at the same time, we can love one mammal and consume another mammal at the same time. And that's because of the cultural ideologies, the ways and the patterns. And again, I'm not against consumption of other animals, but we don't always spend the time to reflect and think about what do all of these relations mean. And I think the challenge here is when we think about not the pet, the love for our companion animals, but the consumption of other animals, what relation, what world, what good do we want to be in? Do we want to be in a world of suffering for other animals? There are today 24 billion chickens on the planet right now, right? And by next week, there will be about 22 billion, because we'll have killed 1 billion and eaten them, and they'll keep going. So I know I'm rambling on here, but my point is there are ways to develop relations even with those that you eat that are not as violent or as harmful. And so the relations, how we construct them, what ideologies we use, and how they're built and maintained, that, I think, is part of understanding the good, or a good at least.
This is really interesting because it reminds me of the Design and Violence Project, because one of the objects that we discussed was the redesign of the slaughterhouse by Temple Grandin, and that prompted one of the biggest debates, I remember. So, that could be another evening. But Neela, we've been talking a lot about goals and means. I mean, everybody in a way went around and around this topic. So for effective altruism, it's really goals and means. And I wanted to ask you, is effective altruism too radical to be truly effective in the world? I mean, when I read that article about museums, I immediately had the knee-jerk reaction. I said, well, then are we gonna all be cured from diarrhea, but there's gonna be no art, So, yeah.
Maybe this is a cop-out, and maybe it's like how persuasive others are. I should say that I don't call myself an effective altruist. I say effective altruistish. Maybe that answers your question. But no, I think that, and the reason I say that is because I see it as a primary lens with which to ask these questions. And I have been mulling over this thing about, should we even have art museums? I'll put it out here. When there are so many thousands, millions of children dying of preventable diseases. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, in a very radical way, you might say, no, we should not be spending money on it. But there are many reasons. It is part of humanity. I enjoy art as a person. You see art when you go to the most rural villages in India, you will see art. So I think art is different from museums. Museums are a way, a system, a cultural ideology about how you make art accessible, but art is that fundamental human, need and expression that we have. So what it does is, I think what effective altruism has done is it makes me question, and it makes me recognize that these things are luxuries in some sense. Going to a museum is a luxury, something that I'm very fortunate to have by living here. It's not accessible to everyone. And so it does make me pause and think about how should I be spending my resources? And this exists to art, it exists to every luxury purchase. My 14-year-old is in the audience today. Exists to should we have her in private school versus public school? So I think the way that I see it is, I'm not sure. I love the Maya Angelou quote, till you know better, when you know better, do better. I'm not sure I have the answer, and I would say it's good or bad, but it makes me think a lot about like, why should museums exist? And I'll leave you with one thought. I would feel horrible if like there was no paintings to look at tomorrow, right? But I actually don't know. Suppose all the museums of the world were like, just they shut. And in some ways, they raise some money, and there was no more. You open the newspaper, and you never see any child dying of a disease. Like, would we be happier? I don't know. Like, we might be, right? We might say, like, yeah, I'll take it. I'll take the lack of art for. Or maybe we'd say, no, actually, I won't. So that's just a question that
I
I've been
wonder if
thinking
it's
about.
necessary for it to be a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You wanted
It
to say
isn't.
something, Miroslav?
Well, yeah, it seems to me like this contrast is often painted between helping those who are dying and then art symbolizing something utterly luxurious, and then these two things are put in contrast. But I'm just wondering whether
But
we
Neil was
almost
talking
need
about
to
museums, not art.
Not art, yeah.
well, museums, but often kind of some of the precious things ends up being also kind of part of that discussion. It seems to me that one ought to, think about nature also as what we do with art and how art is being sold and how art functions within the market. But I guess my point is, I think if we need to rethink the world if we have to make a contrast between high-level art and survival. Then the issue is not one or the other. The issue is how we organize the entirety of our lives so that becomes a problem.
And by the way, there's, I agree completely. There's in Dharavi, which is a slum in Mumbai, there's a museum, the Design Museum Dharavi, right? Which is all about making the people of Dharavi proud of what they produce. And so sometimes museums are, I think it's our responsibility also as museum people, how we position museums within the whole system of well-being of a society, but something else to think about. I wanted to go to Erica because your presentation was so provocative and so deep. And as a Roman Catholic whose dad, who was a surgeon, was called to visit the Pope, I remember having my first knee-jerk reaction against Catholicism when I visited Rome and the Vatican, because all of a sudden this idea of charity and generosity was completely gone, and there were these like big-bellied bishops, and it was really quite insane. It really phrases such as "for the greater good," right, are universalizing the way in which you homogenize both the definition of good and the public that it is serving. So how does this lack of precision impact the effectiveness of humanitarian organizations? Do you think that there could be a way to define what humanitarian organizations should do so as to avoid this, what did you say at the end, that Haiti was like almost an invasion of a market of possible, I don't remember what you said, but it was so strong at the very end.
So this is not an easy question to answer. Either thinking about the church and its wealth and the things that have been accumulated as something that's sort of separate and apart from the everyday practices that occur on the ground, or the idea of attempting to do good somewhere else at a distance, or the idea of thinking about art in a museum space as somehow necessary to consider in the same context as doing good somewhere else. It seems to me that across these is the question of distance. In part, we're considering the challenges or value over there, whether it's suffering or harm, or whether it's beauty or art or elite production. And so for me, the issue about the good is, I think the challenge is when decisions are made separate from the actual kind of empirical or on the ground context in which they're occurring, also, whether it's the decision about whom to aid or the decision about what constitutes the good that should be valued and protected and collected, I think that there can be an oscillation between the suffering that happens at a distance becoming something that's commodified and collected and displayed or performed, as we think about a museum space. So today was my first day ever in MoMA. I walked around, I enjoyed seeing all the people, and it reminded me a little bit of being in like a religious space, in a sense, gazing upon items that are valued by some folk, not necessarily everyone, but we couldn't touch. And although there's little blurbs that give us the kind of the context, there's still such a distance, even though we're in the space between us and what's represented. And I think that there's more I need to think through about this, but I think there's something similar that's happening with the way that we conduct or engage in philanthropy at a distance to solve a problem that may not necessarily involve partnerships, long-term engagement, or networks or connection with a community. And one of the early slides, I was attempting to provoke a question of, can any intervention that's designed without not just input from the communities that are going to be kind of the targets or the objects, but as equals. There's the power difference between who's able to act, who's able to be in a classroom to talk about the good, and those, I think, are the things that are very intractable and are difficult to resolve, whether it's in a faith-based institution or whether it's in a room like this. Mm-hmm. I was thinking you were going to ask me about is charity penitential? Does
well,
but anyway,
those are
that's another
plenary
topic.
Indulgences. I know. I mean, to me, it's this idea of I receive good, therefore I'm subservient is much more interesting than the plenary indulgences. I mean, the idea of charity being expiation, that's old Roman Catholic stuff.
But it was supposed to be a relation. So it was supposed to be, you give, and in return, the one who's receiving prays for you. Yeah. And that is of equal value, in effect, Absolutely. If it's affecting your salvation down the line. But I think that idea of the possibility of an equal kind of exchange has dropped out of many of our charitable or humanitarian or other kinds of transactions. Mm-hmm. And so that distance or the lack of accountability that's going both ways is a challenge. So I think some of the challenges with humanitarian initiatives are they're often designed and implemented and assessed by the home country or the politicians in the home country who are, observing or doing their flybys, drop in and leave. And so, and not necessarily, at least from what I observed in my own research, not necessarily being accountable to or beholden to the Haitian people or the government. Mm-hmm. Talking about corruption, that's a whole nother question.
Yeah, well, but that's another topic indeed.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And Marcia, are hospitals the only places where an ethics panel is daily involved in the working of the institution?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, most hospitals do and are required by governing bodies to have ethics committees, and our hospital and many others also have an ethics consultation service. We also have a moral distress consultation service that are on call 24/7 to deal with difficulties, many of which are problems of relationship and communication. Part of what we work with in our program is helping students and trainees deal with uncertainties. Because as one of my students said, well, all of our tests in medical school have right answers. And none of the clinical cases necessarily do. And, so how do we teach them to swim in uncertainty and ambiguity? And how do we get them away from the reward cycle of being the first person on the team to come up with the right answer? And to sort of jump to conclusions. And these are the kinds of skills. This is also what goes on in an ethics consultation service. One of the people who years ago donated money to UVA for an Institute for Practical Ethics, which was outside the hospital. It was practical ethics and public life, was actually a gentleman whose career had been in aviation, I think Lockheed Martin or one of the big companies like that. And one of the things he was proudest of in his work was that he had set up an ethics program in his corporation. I don't know the details of it, but it was something that was his particular interest, that ethics is everywhere and it's a part of professional life. And some of what we're doing in the museum, again, is interprofessional, often with medical and nursing students and others. Again, trying to foster relationships and do away with some of the stereotypes and bias that's there that, makes it hard for people to really talk to and listen to each other.
Thank you. And Annie, you showed us how much work it is to be good. So it is quite interesting because you talked about, your life, and that's what you do in your art, which is great. And so you talked about how our societal conceptions of what it means to be a good blank are shaped by our cultural output, like the books that we were brought up with and that you were brought up with. So what is the role of your art in aiding your own perception of what being a good mom, for example, means?
I was worried about your question.
No, it's actually Christina's question. I have to say, Christina, great questions.
Thank you for the question. I know I'm saying this in a public space. I feel like I owe so much to therapy. And I feel like making work, a lot of times while I'm making it, I'm just trying to survive. Like I made that work while I was just a few months postpartum. I had a solo show coming up and I was so frustrated. I didn't have maternity leave. I was so sleep deprived and I just needed to make it. It's just how I understand life. And I find that for me, like many years after I make that work, I can kind of like turn around and finally really look at it. And it really helps me, like consolidate what happened there. So I feel like for me, putting a record out there, showing it to other people, being able to have conversations in the gallery or with friends, with other mothers, with other fathers. Actually, my father said this to me, which was really moving. He said that, well, because both my parents, I grew up really poor and both my parents worked an insane amount just to support us. And my dad, taking maybe a very typical male role, didn't do a lot of the child rearing. And he said that after he looked at my work and after he watched me, and he helped me raise my kids, he was like, I need to go apologize to your mom right now. Like, I had no idea. This is what it takes. And I think that conversations like that are really moving and powerful and maybe are there. Like, I feel like my dad having that conversation with my mom allows some kind of remaking of their relationship, and allows me to have a remaking of my relationship with him. So,
does it feel like you've been a good mom now that you look back at your art?
Oh boy.
Or you've given it a good shot, at least?
I give it a good shot. I think that one of the things that I am always confronted with is that as an artist, I embrace ambiguity a lot. And having really young children, like children 3 and under, I think developmentally they want a lot of solidity, like a little bit of black and white thinking is appropriate for them. So sometimes I wonder if I'm putting in too many ingredients to the pot before they're ready, but I don't know, we live in a complicated world, so hopefully I'm equipping them to think really broadly and complexly.
And that's really important, equipping people to exercise their own critical thought and ethical thought. So I stole a lot of your time. Sorry, I've been really selfish. Questions from you. There's a lot. Oh my God. Yeah, I'm gonna let Christina choose. I'm not even gonna try. Sorry for being so selfish.
about self, it's relational.
Hi, I'm Alan McFarland, and thank you, Paula.
Oh, thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you for that shout out. My question is for the entire panel. I'm hearing the word trust, and I'm hearing how the importance of trust in terms of getting to good. Can you talk about where trust comes into all of this? And I'm also thinking about pets and how they trust their owners and each other. So the trust piece seems to be something that I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in relation to good.
Agustin, take it away.
I want to jump right in here because one thing that we complicate or we don't think about when we talk about trust, we're actually talking about predictability in many ways. And so in relationships, predictability allows a kind of commitment and devotion and opening that results in trust. And so with your, let's say you have a dog, dogs get really bent out of shape if you break up your routine or do things differently because they're like, hey, we have a deal, right? The whole pack thing works this way. And the same is with all of our lives, right? Predictability for all primates, for all social mammals, is one of the great stress reducers. And so trust in humans is this meta predictability, right? This ability to go beyond any evidence of predictability and to go beyond ourselves and commit to someone even though we don't necessarily have that predictability. And I think that's a powerful relation. And I think trust is at the heart of much good and unfortunately a lot of bad.
True. Did you? Next. Thank you. Where's the microphone? Yeah. Keep talking and probably it'll go on.
Okay, thank you for this space. As I heard all your words and ideas, I couldn't help but thinking of the relationship between what we understand of for good and power. Like, is good what the power structures or institutions or people with power kind of define for us, and how power plays this understanding within relationships with each other, with the planet, with other species, how it wires what we understand for charity and when we decide to do it, and how it will ultimately tell us what is a life worth living.
Is there a question that you wanted to ask, or?
Ideally, I would hope each one could say a bit about it, but I understand.
And let's say Erica and then
I would
Miroslav.
say yes.
Yeah, Miroslav. Yeah.
That's her.
Yeah.
I think that in the classical religious and philosophical traditions, certainly ancient ones, the good was always construed actually in certain kind of contrast to the power. So you have a statement, a political power. So you have, for instance, statements recently. Archbishop of Canterbury, former, has said that, say in his case, he's a Christian theologian, Christians should be unreliable allies to the power. They should be committed to the good, right? And the power structures have their own interests that are being defended. And so that the good becomes a mode of assessing deployment of power and then standing in the relationship to power. Obviously, you need to have certain kind of power also to be able to act in a good way, to be able to embrace the good. So contrast is not complete power more generally and the good, but certainly kind of political, culturally dominant forms of power and the modes of good are in contrast. You see that in the life of Socrates, you see that in the life of the Buddha, you see it in the life of Jesus. There are many examples of that you can see.
Neela, you seem
I was going to say that it does bother me. I think, effective altruism, we say we have excess resources. That does mean we have certain monetary power, which you exercise for this noble goal of doing good. And I think to your point about not involving the people that you work with, you just exacerbate that power. And I'm not comfortable with that. I do think there is, yes, giving is good. And so I'm much more in the world like we should not be seeing this. We should be seeing a world in which there's more democratization. There's no need for effective altruism. There is, everybody can exercise, and there's not the distance that you talk about. So it is something to think about. I think, with great power comes great responsibility, said that amazing philosopher. I struggle with this a lot, especially when it comes to this notion of effective altruism and power relations.
Can I just add another thing? I think, to your point, a lot of what is defined as good is something that we are, to go back to Bourdieu, we kind of imbibe it. It's not often consciously something that we are taught, it's something that we receive. So for example, thinking about racism or thinking about heterosexism, just many different kinds of isms that are normative and are naturalized. I think that's in part one of the hardest things. So for example, the issue with Haitians, in part, they were treated very differently from other refugee groups, pretty much for no reason apart from race. And so that identifying what is the thing that makes one group have better value than another, or that calls forth a response, or that allows us to be willing to let go of some of our power and defer to others' expertise, or recognize that others even have it. That's I think, a difficult thing, and it doesn't always change from theoretical conversations about the good. Sorry.
No, thank you.
It's often kind of pragmatic engagement and protest. So if we think about civil rights activists, or other kinds of activism that we're witnessing every day.
Erica, close.
Sorry, it's people take risks, whether they possess power or not, to point out that the good is often defined normatively, and we receive it almost in a bodily way. And it's very hard sometimes to recognize that. We can even think about the way that, sorry, I'm going there, but beauty. We saw the slide with AI showing, lighter skinned women having more value as good mothers. Why is that? So those are things that are harder to tackle, but I think important.
Yeah, definitely. Next.
Hi, I'm Wendy Ju. I think one of the things that's interesting about the word good, and especially in the context of a museum, is we might think about it in terms of taste. And I think at the beginning, Paula referred to that. But also, I think there's also like a lot of our tastes are made better through exposure. And so I think it's interesting that we've been sort of dancing around the question of how taste and preference is, inform how it develops a moral value. And I think sometimes people are really critical of museums because they feel like they're just telling us what we're supposed to have a taste for. But I really thought Marcia's presentation, I would really love to hear more about what Marcia has to say about how morality and preference and taste go together, especially in the larger public conversation.
Yeah, and again, I'll speak to some of what, practically speaking, what we do in Clinician's Eye. I mean, for most of our students, yes, they've probably been in art museums before, but they've also expected to either learn from labels or learn from a docent, or getting a mini lecture about these pieces which were good enough for the museum to acquire and exhibit, and therefore demonstrated somebody's taste. I was really intrigued with what you had about the early stuff from MoMA about what is good design, and sort of dictating it and helping a whole population acquire good taste. So what we do is, if I or one of my colleagues is working with students with a painting, say, I will deliberately stand in front of the label so they can't see it. What we're talking about is what they see and what they have to say about what they see. We just ask them, describe what you see. And they're in a small group of, no more than 10 or 12. And they listen to each other and they notice different things. They also notice that, They're not so much attaching value to them as we are simply starting with an inventory. And then people bring from their own cultural background, their own preferences, their own learning, some assessments of what's going on, but they also modify what they're seeing and how they're feeling about it because of what they're hearing from others. And what's been interesting is in the hierarchical world of medicine, sometimes we'll have like a department will come, faculty, residents who are trainees, and the medical students who are rotating with them. They'll come and do clinician's eye in place of a grand rounds. And so they'll come to the museum, and all of a sudden, the chair of the department or a senior attending physician is on the same level with a medical student. And they can talk to each other in new ways, talk about power and power differentials and people sort of shaking in their boots when they're in the hospital in these teams. But in the museum, it's a different kind of thing. And the values come up and people begin to see the art, they interact with the art, and something new is created. They're also free not to like what they see. And, because one kid said, if it's in the museum, I thought we were supposed to like it. And it's like, no.
Not at all.
And there is stuff that, does disturb them, but we end up, one of the slides I showed was the Sandlot riots in San Francisco, anti-Chinese, horrible anti-Chinese violence. And we began to use that painting when I was teaching a small class, and I had 3 or 4 Asian American students, and this was during COVID, and they all had heard individually anti-Asian slurs and things, done to them, written to them, said to them. We talked about that piece, and it was freeing to them. We could all talk about it because it was about the painting, but they were able then to have a civil conversation triangulated by the art. And that was very different experience than seeing that painting hanging on a wall and reading the little label about
being
what
taught that it's
and
good.
being taught that it's a good painting.
By the way, I want to clarify, we're not only decades, but light years away from that little list. I would say that most of my colleagues, and certainly I, do not take anymore as our job to tell people what's good or what's bad, but rather to do what we discussed here, which is to stimulate any individual's critical sense. So when faced with the ambiguity and the chaos that we see today, they are able to do their own reasoning, hopefully with respect and connection to other humans and other species. Yes. So we have time for one more question. So I'll leave it to you to choose the first. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
So this is a little bit for going back to Paula, what you had shown. Initially, I thought was very provocative, one slide where you talked about universals of some sort. Universals that could be maybe aesthetic or form-based, that could be defined, let's say, universally as good. And how do we negotiate that with the idea of cultural diversity and diversity of perspectives and the cultural baggage that comes with evaluating what's good? So that's a question that maybe is open to a lot of people, but
who wants to take this question? Do you want to go, Miroslav? No, Erica, go. No.
Happy, but the other people have spoken as much, so please.
I mean, I think about this, like, I guess not just occasionally, a lot, because for a long time in my life, I guess as an artist, I was always taught to rely on my gut feeling. And then as I got older, I realized my gut feeling is not just a gut feeling, right? It's like all the media I've ever consumed, all of the cultural background, and I'm multicultural, right? So what is a good woman by Chinese standards from the 1950s passed on to me? And what is a good woman by American standards by all these generations passed down to me? And so for me, it's a constant revision and refining of that gut feeling, right? And to kind of trust my body and my gut response, but also to question, like, why do I feel disgusted by this, or why am I so drawn to this? And to ask it in a very unjudgmental way, right? Like, just to have that experience in a museum of having these kind of unjudgmental conversations in front of an artifact that can open up these questions with myself. And so it continues. I don't know, the question is really good, because I think about that all the time with my kids, like when they recoil from something, or when they want to obsess over something, we talk about it, like, where do you think this comes from, kind of thing.
Miroslav, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just maybe a brief comment. I think that we do have two kind of contrasting values. On the one hand, we have a value of the particularity, particular experience, particular person, particular experience at particular time, and deeper we go into it, the kind of richer we feel the life is. On the other hand, we are all connected. We live on the single planet. We are in many ways a single humanity. And then to lose the kind of the universal would be, in a sense, also at the same time to betray the particular, right? Because you would create suddenly those individuals that are constantly at odds with one another. And so the great question is, how does one mediate between the particularity of experiences and of lives and the commonality that is de facto actually always there? And what kind of modes of relating do we develop so that we can bridge between the two? Even in our conversation on the screen, Rossi was emphasizing these individual particular experiences of people and cultures, and your friend was emphasizing the common good, and it has to be a planetary common good. And I think we have to find ways to hold the two together. I would say also that the great traditions have sought to do that. They might not have done it always in the best way, but kind of emphasis on particularity. I'll just end with a little note of a Muslim mystic, Ibn Arabi. So the Bible for the Muslim, or Quran for the Muslim, or for any biblical text, they seem to be this holy thing then, and kind of imposes itself as universal. And he also believed that, but at the same time, he said, if I read the same passage twice, and it means the same thing to me, and it means the same thing to me, I have not read it right. That is to say, because I myself am always in the flux of time. And therefore you have here, for instance, with Ibn Arabi, you have this mediation already of something universal with something particular, time-bound, at this time, this place, this person.
Great way to end this conversation. I would like to thank my fabulous panelists. And I would like to thank also my fabulous colleague, Christina Mushul. And now I invite you to have great snacks and delicious wine. I deviate from the usual, but also I think I can speak on behalf of my whole panel. We would like to leave you with this thought: 42. Thank you. Stay for wine and snacks.